As the boarding process commenced, the sounds of rolling luggage and bustling footsteps filled the cabin. This particular flight from New York to Paris was buzzing with excitement. Among the first-class passengers was Jordan, a young, well-dressed black man in his early 30s, carrying a serene confidence and a book tucked under his arm. Jordan, a successful entrepreneur, had recently earned the trip as part of an award for his accomplishments, and he was thrilled to experience first-class service for the first time. But as he took his seat, he could feel a few glances darting his way, some curious, others slightly judgmental. Jordan had grown accustomed to handling such reactions, but he chose to focus on the comfort of his luxurious seat in the journey ahead. As he settled in, he noticed an air hostess, Sarah, approaching, her eyes shifting suspiciously as they landed on him. "Excuse me, sir," she said with a polite but sharp tone. "I need to check your ticket." Jordan raised an eyebrow, surprised. He had already shown his boarding pass at the gate and been directed to his seat by another flight attendant. "Sure," he replied, pulling his boarding pass out of his pocket and handing it to her. She examined it for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before handing it back without a word. "Please make sure to stay in your assigned seat," she added curtly, turning on her heel before Jordan could respond. He felt a wave of irritation but tried to brush it off. It wasn't the first time he had faced assumptions, and he had learned over time to choose his battles wisely. He opened his book and tried to relax, reminding himself that he deserved to be here just as much as anyone else in first class. As the flight took off, the attendants began the routine of serving refreshments and taking meal orders. When Sarah reached Jordan's row, she hesitated, her expression a mixture of irritation and impatience. She placed a menu in front of him, but instead of her usual professional demeanor, her voice dripped with condescension. "We have a fine selection of wines and spirit," she said, almost as if mocking him, "though I'm not sure what you'd prefer." Jordan frowned, taken aback by her tone. "I'll just have water, thank you." "Sure, water it is," she replied, almost as if to say, "I expected as much." Jordan's jaw tightened. It wasn't just the tone, it was the pointed implication, the subtle insinuation that he somehow didn't belong or couldn't appreciate what was offered. He was tempted to speak up, but decided against it. He took a deep breath, telling himself not to let one person ruin his experience. As she walked down the aisle, he could hear her making warm, friendly conversation with other passengers, her professionalism intact. It was a sharp contrast that stung more than he wanted to admit. But he held his composure, focusing on his book and letting the slight roll off his back. The journey was long, and he was determined not to let her rudeness dampen his spirits. After a while, Sarah returned with his water, practically slamming it down on the table in front of him, water splashing slightly over the edge. She didn't apologize or even acknowledge the spill. Instead, she moved on to the next passenger, who received a carefully poured glass of wine and a warm smile. Jordan clenched his fists, struggling to maintain his calm. He felt embarrassed, not just for himself but for the situation, something he felt no one else in first class had to endure. The next incident occurred during the dinner service. Sarah approached him, once again with that same disdainful expression. "Your meal choice?" she asked, her tone curt. "I'll have the chicken, please," Jordan replied, keeping his tone polite despite his frustration. She nodded and returned a few minutes later with his plate. However, she practically tossed it onto his table, the utensils rattling. Jordan stared at her, incredulous. But before he could say anything, she had already moved on, giving him no chance to address her unprofessional behavior. Throughout the meal, Jordan noticed how attentive and kind Sarah was to other passengers, chatting with them, ensuring their needs were met, and even laughing at their jokes. The difference was glaring, and the other passengers began to notice too, throwing curious glances his way. Jordan felt his cheeks grow warm, embarrassment mixing with anger. As the flight continued, Sarah's passive-aggressive behavior only worsened. Each time she came by, she found new ways to make him feel unwelcome. It reached a tipping point when she accidentally spilled coffee near him, the hot liquid nearly splashing onto his trousers. This time, Jordan couldn't stay silent. "Excuse me," he said, his tone icy. "Is there a problem?" Sarah froze, momentarily caught off guard. She quickly regained her composure, plastering a fake smile on her face. No, sir. No problem at all, she replied with a saccharine sweetness that only made her hostility more evident. I've noticed that you've been less than polite to me during this entire flight, Jordan continued, his voice low but firm. I don't know what your issue is, but I would appreciate it if you could just do your job professionally. The surrounding passengers, having overheard the exchange, fell silent, their attention fully on the confrontation. Sarah's cheeks flushed as she realized that her behavior was now under scrutiny. Without another word, Jordan returned to his seat, crossing his arms and focusing on calming himself down. Sarah walked away, her expression a mixture of anger and embarrassment. An older woman seated across the aisle leaned over, giving Jordan a sympathetic smile. Don't worry, dear, she whispered. Some people just can't hide their prejudices. It says more about her than it does about you. Jordan smiled back, grateful for her support. For the remainder of the flight, he kept to himself, hoping to put the incident behind him. However, as the flight prepared to land, Sarah returned one last time, this time with the head flight attendant by her side. Sir, the head attendant said, her expression neutral, we were made aware of some issues during the flight, and we wanted to personally apologize for any inconvenience. Jordan nodded, his expression unreadable. I appreciate that, he replied, his tone polite but distant. The head attendant continued. Our crew is here to ensure all our passengers have a comfortable and welcoming experience, regardless of any differences. If there's anything we can do to make up for the poor service, please let us know. Sarah stood beside the head attendant, visibly uncomfortable, her face flushed with embarrassment. The head attendant's pointed words left no doubt that she was addressing the situation directly. Jordan took a deep breath, feeling a sense of satisfaction but choosing not to escalate the matter further. He gave the head attendant a brief nod. Thank you for acknowledging it. That's enough for me. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to disembark, several people stopped by to offer Jordan words of support, further solidifying the reality that Sarah's behavior had not gone unnoticed. As Jordan gathered his belongings, he saw Sarah at the front of the cabin, her expression one of barely concealed shame. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, he saw a flicker of regret in her gaze. She had clearly been reprimanded, her pride wounded as she realized that her unprofessionalism had been exposed to everyone. Jordan walked down the aisle with his head held high, feeling a renewed sense of confidence. He hadn't needed to shout, argue, or even let her hostility disrupt his calm. By remaining composed, he had turned the situation around, letting her actions speak for themselves. As he exited the plane and entered the bustling terminal, he allowed himself a small smile. The experience had been unpleasant, but he knew it was an important reminder. Dignity and self-respect had a power all their own. For every person who tried to undermine him, there were countless others willing to stand with him. And as he stepped out into the warm sunlight, Jordan felt a sense of gratitude, not only for his resilience, but for the unexpected support from the strangers who reminded him that, in the face of ignorance and prejudice, there was always room for grace.